your new book series, A Woman Looking at Men, Looking at Women. Some of the articles in there has actually been published in scientific journals, and this is a very rare thing to have, like, a leg in both camps when we talk about the arts and the sciences. And this is actually where I think I would like to sort of start out, now that we have this particular situation. In one of the essays, Why One Story and Not Another, you look at the art of writing fiction in quite a different way from what I have read before, sort of from inside the mind, you might say, looking at mechanics of writing, what is going on there. And then you say, you ask the question, one of the questions we'll be getting to is, why is it that something rings true and something sounds false, even though the writing is a piece of fiction? And I would really like to know your thoughts about it.
Yes, well, so this is a very interesting question. Why, when there is no objective reality for a work of fiction, it is not historical. So what is the measure? When we know that we are not dealing with facts. And at the same time, as readers, we recognize what I think of as the truth of a fictional work. And that truth, it doesn't matter whether it's supernatural story, whether the characters are flying zebras. So it's not about that. The supernatural can be part of it, and Frankenstein is a great novel. But I think what happens between the reader and the text is that there is an emotional resonance. We recognize a form of emotional truth, and that is where it comes from. Parsing that in the mind-brain question is not so easy. So you need to have an embodied subject in order to address this kind of truth.
But Paul, this is also a question that it not only concerns the reader, it also concerns the writer when you're sitting writing. How do you know when something has the ring of truth and it doesn't?
Because, okay, not talking about myself as a writer, but as a reader. If you read a writer who sentimentalizes something, or does something that is inconsistent with the character he or she has built up, then, as a reader, the alarm bells go off, and you say, this is false. Another instance of falseness, I think, in writing is novelists who fall back on conventional language and cliches, tired phrases. And when you see that lack of invention in a writer, you lose faith in the writer. I mean, I was just reading all this material, Stephen Crane, the American writer, and he was sitting there with his friend. He was in his 20s, and someone had put in the phrase, from time immemorial. And Crane looked at this and he said, any writer who would use that tired old phrase is not worth being a writer. And he took the book and he threw it across the room. I don't want to read this anymore. And that's how you feel. A good writer builds up trust in the reader. And then you can go on all these long journeys with the writer. But if you doubt the writer, then the pleasure's taken away, I think.
But there's also, then it sort of also becomes a question of style and expression. But how do you, when you write, recognize when there's emotional truth to what you write? Well, because sometimes it's very tempting. You've written something, it's damn good, but it just doesn't feel right.
Oh yes, but I think I quote Robert Louis Stevenson in that essay, who is talking about one of his works, and he said, it's so well written. And I just don't know what's wrong with it. Why is it so wrong? You know, and I think that is the feeling that you move off and that you are in some important way telling a lie. So that good works of fiction, whether you're writing or reading them, you feel that the writer has had the courage to go into places that may be frightening but true.
Yeah.
And that's why platitudes and cliches are betraying. They're falling back on a structure that's preordained. Many books are like this.
Yeah.
And for me, we have the same response.
Yeah.
It feels false.
False.
Yeah.
Now, there's another thing to say. Now I'm talking from the point of view of the writer. I think my credo has always been that the book itself is what I'm trying to write. The book itself is the only thing that matters. And therefore, well-written paragraphs, well-written passages that somehow don't help the book as an overall structure must go. You have to cut them out. And you might spend a lot of time and effort on making really good sentences. And yet, when you look at the whole thing, you realize that in order to make it a good book, you have to get rid of a lot of good material.
Yeah.
It's paradoxical, but a book is about rhythm and pace, and I've always thought of books as a kind of musical composition, and it's as if you're listening to a piece by Beethoven. Okay, sometimes Beethoven will repeat, towards the end of a symphony, the same phrase 3 times, and it's good. But if he did it 6 times, it would be really terrible. And even though you just have to know when to stop.
So I think this is right. There's truth in melody, right? Where does melody come from? What are we talking about? I think that, early exchanges in our life form the underground of language, and they form what becomes the rhythm of the mature writer, the rhythm and music. And that is a kind of inner emotional rightness that has to have a long history, a long history before even our memories, our conscious memories are formed.
So the old idea about one being given gifts at birth is maybe somehow right. But it's in the very early stages that we've been giving gifts.
I think one of the problems with the Western tradition, and perhaps recently, is that the idea of genius, right? Genius is not born; it's made. And it's made through others. So the music I'm talking about is not in somebody's genetic material. It's a music that comes out of experiences with others early in life and develops, and every stage is important. The writer, for any good writer, reading is important. The music of others become part of your own music. The thoughts of others. That's what reading is. It's a form of being possessed by another.
So reading and relationships are maybe one of the answers to the question of the title of the essay, why one story and not another?
Yeah, well, reading is a relationship.
Yeah.
So reading is an experience of an other on the page. And the reader and the writer create the book together. Yeah. You've always said this too, that it's a meeting of consciousness.
There's no book without the reader. I mean, we write these novels to give to you, and then it's a shared experience. It's one and one and one and one. Unlike going to the opera or the movies or the theater, where you're in an audience, just like this, reading a book, you're alone, and you're alone with the words of the writer echoing in your head. And that's why I've always said that a book, a novel, is the only place, I think, in the world where 2 strangers can meet on terms of absolute intimacy.
Yes.
And that's why I think, in spite of what everyone says, novels are not going to die. We need them. In one way or another, we need them.
Yeah.
Siri, you also write in the essay that where do you get your ideas from is sort of the most idiotic question you can ask. So I have to ask it, of course.
Yeah. Well, no, I say that writers believe that where do you get your ideas is a stupid question. Actually, it's a profound question. Yeah. It's a philosophical question. It's very deep. What the heck is an idea? Right? And what are these forms that begin to emerge in any artistic project? A novel. How does it come about? Yeah. You know, not in this book, but in an earlier book of essays, I've treated it twice. I've always thought about fiction as writing fiction is like remembering what never happened. Because memory is involved. And I think memory is the key to those emotional truths that I'm talking about. Yeah. The story that you're making, the characters that you are creating, they have to answer some profound reality. Yeah. And that, you know, and then you hope that it also answers the reader's reality. But that's the judgment. So where do you get your ideas is a deep question. And defining an idea in the Western tradition is very complex. Yeah. Which another essay treats, the mind-body problem. Yeah. Which is a big essay. Big one. Very, very interesting.
It's a book within a book.
It's a book within a book, yeah. Could you tell us a little about what that specific essay is about? And then maybe do a little reading afterwards? It's not from there you're going to read, I think.
Right, so, but I think just that if you ask anyone that simple question, what do you think the mind is? People are going to have a very hard time answering that question. Is the mind the same as the body? Is the brain the same as the mind? Can you reduce our subjective individual experience to brain function? These are deep questions, and the answers that are given to them affect all of our lives. That's really the point of the essay. The way we think about depression, psychiatric ailments, drugs, all of these aspects of our lives that touch all of us are related to the mind-body problem that has never been solved, right? Yeah. And so that essay was a way of taking the reader through both the history of the problem and speculation as to possible answers.
But what I also really like about the book is that all these philosophical questions, somehow they almost all the time end up to touch upon the writing of fiction. Yes. Somehow it's in the picture all the time. So it's a work that's in many respects is a highly scientific work, but understandable, I must say. Yeah. Yeah. but it has this aura of writing novels and fiction, and what's that about?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was just thinking, Paul has made movies, and you've written many novels, but you've never done the sort of science philosophy stuff that I've done.
No.
But I have found in the... No.
I haven't. No. Yeah. I don't know why it's funny.
I don't know why it's funny either. It's not funny. But actually, so what I have found, though, this long, many years trajectory, is that I firmly believe that the novel is the greatest form for actually ideas and philosophy. Yeah. That there is no better place to express the multiplicity of philosophical views as the novel. And of course, you have Kierkegaard here, who did exactly that, right? Kierkegaard's Masks. And
yeah, well, he's a philosopher who writes like a novelist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's a quote somewhere in the book that says something like that books or stories are for the people who don't quite feel there's enough in the world or at home in the world, that writers and readers, they have this in common, that there's a missing thing that you can maybe find or look for in novels?
Listen, novels are the place, I mean other books as well, but novels are the place where we can have experiences that we would never have otherwise, right? We can go safely into experiences that expand our consciousness and our unconsciousness that are impossible in other forms, right? And that's why it's important to read
and
novels.
also we have this very, we usually put science here and the arts there, and the twain shall never meet, but once in a while. But I can't help thinking that in many ways, to be a novelist, to write novels, to write fiction, is kind of like being a scientist that examines the world with words and ideas.
What do you think?
I'm not so sure.
Listen, the methods and epistemologies are different, right? I mean, a scientist uses a scientific method. We don't when we're writing novels.
You have to be very tough-minded to make good art.
Yeah.
Whether you're a painter or a composer or a writer.
Yeah.
And I guess it demands a rigor that science demands of scientists, but it's different. As Siri says, the methods are different.
The methods are different.
The objectives are different.
But maybe the underground. There's a favorite quote I have from Einstein, who was asked by Jacques Hadamard how he worked. And he said, none of my actual work has to do with signs, S-I-G-N-S. My work is visual, emotional, and muscular. And I think that's where physicists and poets meet, in the underground, right? But the methods they use to arrive at the answer are different for a physicist and a poet.
For the whole thing about what is genetics and what is environment, that must have been part of your...
This is a very clever segue that you just made, I have to say. This is,
I think so too.
It's a genius.
Very clever.
My hat is off to you, Tim.
In 4, 3, 2, 1, you sort of slip around it by giving the 4 Fergusons the same genetics, but the whole thinking about how much is environment, how much is genetics? Is your answer that environment is everything?
No. My answer is that you can't really separate them, because I think we are born with the genetic material that we got from our parents, but at the same time we're also shaped by our experiences and the environment we grow up in and live in. I mean, to say, all you have to do is think of very extreme examples, and then it becomes obvious. A child is born who, under ideal circumstances, is loved and fed and taken care of, and blossoms into a rounded, intelligent, fulfilled human being. That same person with cruel parents who's locked up in a closet when he's 6 months old and never gets to have any interaction with other human beings is going to turn into somebody less than human and will never learn how to speak and will never have a life. But genetically, they're the same person.
Yes.
So that's extreme. Or you can think of horror of horrors. What if you grow up and you're in Syria today and you're a child and your city is being bombed into rubble? How are you going to grow up without having, if you survive it, without lifelong traumas that are going to affect everything about your existence? And then, go into smaller, more modest nuances. The cold mother, the brutal father, or the indifferent parent who can shape the destiny of a child, as opposed to the loving parent, or the smothering parent. They're parents who love too much, and all these things affect how people develop. And so I think in this book, the 4 Fergusons even though they have the same parents, the circumstances are different for each one of them. And maybe not enormously different, but different enough so that the boys develop in different ways. And they acquire different personalities, even though many of their talents are similar, because they have the same bodies, after all. And so they're robust kids. They like to play sports. They're good at it. They all are very sensitive to music, for example. They all veer towards some kind of writing activity, of one sort or another, and yet they're very different.
Yeah.
Did you have in mind maybe to make one of them more to expose them to more radical things?
I didn't want to. I thought it was very easy to make up a book of 4 parallel lives, and then to have one become an astronaut, and the other one a cowboy, and the other one a bank robber, and the other one a priest or something. No, I didn't want to do that. I wanted them to be sort of the same, but different. I didn't want to work in science fiction. I wanted to rein it into what was, to me, psychologically plausible.
And after all, they're born in a similar milieu.
Yes.
So that it's not Syria and the United States during a war. So they grow up with similar environment. But in science, it's called epigenetics, right? So epigenetics is the study of how, after DNA replication, we all have that, our DNA, that the genetics can be affected by stresses to the organism as a whole, right? So in one of the essays, so that you can actually have changes in the molecular structure of an animal after DNA replication that can then be inherited.
In other words, after birth.
After birth, after you're there. And stress to the organism can actually change the molecular structure. That's fascinating.
And it seems to be knowledge that has a hard time to get hold. It's like we live in a culture that doesn't really want to know too much about it because it's not practical when you look at the mind in a more computer metaphorical way.
Becomes the inside. The outside becomes inside. And Paul's book is a great example of how we integrate what Alfred North Whitehead called drops of experience, right? Into our material reality. And that's what's hard for people to understand. These young men are all the product of the drops of experience that are presented in the text.
But you see, I want to say about the kind of work that Siri's doing. I think if you take it a step further, you see, trying to understand who we are and what we are. What is a human being? I mean, this is Siri's driving ambition. Not to answer the question, but to wrestle with the question. And to keep coming at it from different angles. But I think what this leads to, if we have a better understanding of things like epigenetics and so on, it can help us form laws in our societies that will help people and not hurt them. And will become wiser and better at helping people achieve the utmost that they're capable of, rather than squashing them with arbitrary rules, the way so many cultures do.
Siri, should you do a little reading now?
Yeah, so here we are at Louisiana, and I thought it would be appropriate to read a very short passage from an essay about Louise Bourgeois.
Who's here in the museum.
Who's here, I mean, with us in some important way. And this is a couple of pages in. It was actually began as a talk that I gave at the Haus der Kunst in Munich, where they had a beautiful Louise Bourgeois show. And also, I think it relates to the writing of fiction, how other artists feed us, how they are part of becoming an artist. My Louise Bourgeois is complex, brilliant, contradictory, fiercely direct at times, but also discreet. She wears a veil. Sometimes she wears a mask. Her power lies not in confession, but in a visual vocabulary of ambiguity, an ambiguity so potent it becomes suspense. The cells are not blunt statements. They are indistinct murmurs. They are great because they are irreducible. The narratives and commentaries L.B., Louise Bourgeois, created for these works are like musical accompaniments, but they are not codes or explanations. She knew this. When her compulsively quotable analyses of her own works are put together, they create not a synthesis, but clusters of antitheses. They are the ejaculations of a quick mind interested above all in its own contents. We must also recognize this. She was a shrewd orchestrator of her own legacy. Bourgeois' cells are made like poems in the visual language of material things, and they startle us because we have not seen them before. They are original. This does not mean there is no history, no sociology, no past in the work, no influences, but rather that Bourgeois had to forge a trajectory for her art from another perspective because, as she said, the art world belonged to men. Susan Howe writes about Emily Dickinson. She built a new poetic form from her fractured sense of being eternally on intellectual borders, where confident masculine voices buzzed an alluring and inaccessible discourse backward through history into aboriginal anagogy. Howe sees the problem. How do I, choosing messages from the code of others in order to participate in the universal theme of language, pull she from all the myriad symbols and sightings of he? The task is to find an answering form, one that does not betray the real, the emotional truths of experience. Dickinson stayed home and wrote. Bourgeois stayed home and made sculptures. It was easier to stay hidden, she said, from the world that belonged to the men. But in the end, she regarded her period of hiding as good luck. She came blasting out into the world at an age Dickinson never lived to be. My life had stood a loaded gun, wrote Emily Dickinson. Let me say this. My Louise Bourgeois has stirred up the contents of my own dungeon, the muddy, aromatic, sadistic, and tender underground of dreams and fantasies that are part of every life. But artists are cannibals. We consume other artists, and they become part of us, flesh and bone, only to be spewed out again in our own works. When mingled with Søren Kierkegaard, the 17th century natural philosopher Margaret Cavendish, Mary Shelley's monster in Frankenstein, Milton's Satan, and heaven knows whom else, my chewed up and digested Louise Bourgeois returned in the artist's character at the heart of my most recent novel, The Blazing World, Harriet Burden, a.k.a. Harry. To be perfectly honest, I was unaware of the degree to which L.B. had influenced H.B. until I began preparing this piece. The unconscious works in mysterious ways. I'm skipping a little. What do they share? They are both women. L.B. was tiny in stature. Harry is enormous. The real artist and the invented artist are both interested in sexual blur, in undoing the hard lines between the feminine and the masculine. The ambiguous body appeals to them both. Bourgeois made a career of the mingled body of penis and breast and buttocks and openings and bulbous protrusions that are neither one nor the other, not man, not woman. Bourgeois wrote, We are all vulnerable in some way. We are all male, female. I'm going to skip a little bit here, and then after her husband died, Bourgeois cannibalized her own father in her art. In the great pink red maw she created and called The Destruction of the Father, a work that is awful and gleeful and faintly comic too. Her story for the work. She and her brother hated the man's overbearing and dominant ways, and so one day they killed him and gobbled him up. This fury belongs especially to women making art of all kinds, because women artists are put into boxes that are hard to climb out of. The box is labeled women's art. When was the last time you heard anyone talk about a man artist, a man novelist, a man composer? The man is the norm, the rule, the universal. The white man's box is the whole world. Louise Bourgeois was an artist who made art. We are all male, female. All great art is male, female. The last paragraph now. My Louise Bourgeois understood the need, the burning compulsion to translate real experience into passionate symbols. The experience that must be translated is deep and old. It is made of memory, both conscious and unconscious. It is of the body, male and female, male, female. And whether the artworks are created from the letters of the alphabet or from fabric, steel, plaster, glass, stone, lead, or iron, they are vehicles of communication for an imaginary other, the one who will look and listen. By symbols, I mean things that are your friends, but that are not real, Louise Bourgeois said. No, symbols are not real. They are representations, but they are alive inside us nevertheless when we look and when we read. They become us, part of our cellular makeup, part of our bodies and brains. They live on in memory and sometimes through the strange convolutions we call imagination, become other works of art.
This big book, as you've probably gathered, is about 4 parallel lives of one person, whose name is Archie Ferguson. The passage I'm going to read is not so much about him, but about what was going on around him in his years as a college student in the 1960s, in particular the year 1968. This Ferguson, who's Ferguson number 1, is now, in the story, a student at Columbia University, a place where I went, and it was a time of tremendous tumult, not only in the society, but also in the university. And by the late spring of 1968, Columbia exploded. The students took over buildings. It was the occupations that went on for more than a week. Riot police came in and broke it all up. There was fighting, bloodshed. It was really quite a time. I should say the name Newark is mentioned. Newark, the city in New Jersey, where in 1967 there had been terrible racial conflict, and what people call the riots, what black people call the rebellion, took place in '67. That's referred to. And then there's a character, Amy, who is Ferguson's girlfriend in this cycle, and she is an active member of the left-wing student organization, SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. But Ferguson, who's of the left, but not as active as she is, he works for the student newspaper as a reporter. And so he's following a lot of these events and writing about them for the newspaper. All right, so here we are. Early 1968, Ferguson saw the situation as a series of concentric circles. The outer circle was the war and all that went with it. American soldiers in Vietnam, enemy combatants from the north and the south, Viet Cong, Ho Chi Minh, the government in Saigon, Lyndon Johnson and his cabinet, U.S. foreign policy since the end of World War II, body counts, napalm, burning villages, hearts and minds, escalation, pacification, peace with honor. Those are all phrases used at the time. The second circle represented America, the 200 million on the home front, the press, newspapers, magazines, radio, television, the anti-war movement, the pro-war movement, the Black Power movement, the counterculture movement, hippies and yippies, pot and LSD, rock and roll, the underground press, Zap Comics, the Merry Pranksters, the Motherfuckers. That was an anarchist group at the time. The Motherfuckers. The Hard Hats, these are the construction workers, right-wing construction workers. The Hard Hats and the Love It or Leave It crowd. Right-wing people had bumper stickers on that in that time saying, love it or leave it, meaning if you don't like America, get out. The Love It or Leave It crowd. The empty air occupied by the so-called generation gap between middle-class parents and their children, and the vast throng of nameless citizens who would come to be known as the silent majority. The third circle was New York, which was almost identical to the second circle, but more immediate, more vivid. A laboratory filled with examples of the aforementioned social currents that Ferguson could perceive directly with his own eyes rather than through the filter of written words or published images, all the while taking into account the nuances and particularities of New York itself, which was different from all the other cities in the United States, especially because of the enormous divide between rich and poor. The fourth circle was Columbia, Ferguson's temporary abode, the close-to-hand little world that surrounded him and his fellow students, the encompassing ground of an institution no longer walled off from the big world outside it, for the walls had come down, and the outside was now indistinguishable from the inside. The fifth circle was the individual, each individual person in any one of the four other circles. But in Ferguson's case, the individuals who counted most were the ones he knew personally, above all, the friends he shared his life with at Columbia, and above all those others, of course, the individual of individuals, the dot at the center of the smallest of the five circles, the person who was himself. 5 realms, 5 separate realities, but each one was connected to the others, which meant that when something happened in the outer circle, the war, its effects could be felt throughout America, New York, Columbia, and every last dot in the inner circle of private individual lives. When the war escalated in the spring of 1967, for example, 500,000 people marched in the streets of New York on April 15th to condemn the war and call for the immediate withdrawal of American troops from Vietnam. 5 days after that, on the Columbia campus uptown, 300 members of SDS showed up at John Jay Hall to ask some questions of the Marine recruiters who had set up their tables in the lobby and were attacked by a charging gang of 50 jocks. Jocks were the athletes in schools, usually right-wing, and the NROTC boys. NROTC is Reserve Officer Training Corps. Universities had this. You could train to become an officer in the Navy, which led to a bloody scuffle of flying fists and bashed-in noses that had to be broken up by the police. The following afternoon, the largest demonstration at Columbia in over 30 years was held in the Van Am quadrangle between John Jay and Hamilton Halls as 800 members and supporters of SDS protested Marine recruiting on campus, and 500 pro-Marine jock hecklers threw eggs at them from the other side of the fence on South Field in their own counter-demonstration. Ferguson and Amy had both been involved in that hectic scene. she as a participant and he as a witness reporter. And when he told her about his concentric circles theory that night at the West End, which was a local bar, that night at the West End, she smiled at him. She smiled at him and said, "But of course, my dear Holmes, how clever of you." The point was that no one was happy on either side. The pro-war people were becoming more and more frustrated by Johnson's failure to win the war. And the anti-war people were becoming more and more frustrated by their failure to force Johnson to end the war. Meanwhile, the war continued to grow. 500,000 troops, 550,000 troops. And the bigger it became, the more the outer circle pressed in on the other circles, squeezing them ever more tightly together. And before long, the spaces between them had shrunk to the merest slivers of air, which was making it hard for the lone ones trapped in the center to breathe. And when a person can't breathe, he starts to panic. And panic is something close to craziness, a feeling that you have lost your mind and are about to die. And by early 1968, Ferguson was beginning to feel that everyone had gone crazy as the crazy people who talked out loud to themselves on Broadway. And bit by bit, he had become as crazy as everyone else. Then, in those early months of the new year, everything began to snap. The shock attacks by Viet Cong sapper commandos on more than 100 South Vietnamese cities and towns during the Tet Offensive of January 30th proved that America could never win the war, even though American troops fought back and overwhelmed the enemy in every battle of the offensive, killing 37,000 Viet Cong, compared to the 2,000 lost by the U.S., with tens of thousands of other Viet Cong fighters either wounded or captured, and 500,000 South Vietnamese civilians turned into homeless refugees. The message to the American public was that the North Vietnamese would never give up, that they would go on fighting until the last person in their country was dead. And how many more American soldiers would it take to destroy that country? Would the 500,000 already there have to be increased to 1 million, to 2 million, to 3 million? And if so, would the destruction of North Vietnam not also mean the destruction of America? 2 months later, Johnson appeared on television and announced that he would not be running for re-election in the fall. It was an admission of failure, an acknowledgement that public support for the war had eroded to such a point that his policies had been rejected. And Ferguson, who had admired the good Johnson of the War on Poverty and the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and had loathed the bad Johnson of Vietnam, found himself in the uncomfortable position of feeling sorry for the President of the United States, at least for a minute or two, as he tried to put himself in the head of Lyndon Johnson and experience the anguish he must have felt in deciding to abdicate his throne. And then Ferguson felt glad, both glad and relieved that LBJ would soon be gone. 5 days after that, Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis. Another bullet fired by an American nobody. Another blow to the collective nervous system. And then hundreds of thousands of people ran out into the streets and started smashing windows and setting buildings on fire. 128 Newarks. The 5 concentric circles had merged into a single black disc. It was an LP record now, and the song it kept playing was an old blues number called "Can't Take It No More Sugar, 'Cause My Heart Hurts So Bad." Those were the days.
Paul, this feeling of the concentric circle sort of closing in on you, that seems to me like it could have been a very good description of what's going on at the moment. You know, they elected Nixon 5 minutes after this, and we're sort of saddled with Mr. Trump at the moment.
Yes, and Nixon kept the war going. U.S. troops didn't withdraw till '73, and North Vietnam didn't finally end it by conquering the South until 1975. So 7 years after that, the war ended. Yeah. Think of how long that was. Yeah.
And of course, Nixon was a profoundly dishonest and criminal person, but he was clever.
That at least is something.
Now we really are looking at a venal phenomenon, but it is different.
Yeah. No. It's Trump is the culmination of many years of growing right-wing power in the United States, and a loss of faith in the government, and a loss of faith in democracy. I mean, Barry Goldwater was the candidate in '64, and he was very much to the right, and he was destroyed in the election by Johnson. But in '68, Nixon won, and we on the left, then the kids, you know, we felt the country was going to become an enlightened, progressive place, but we didn't understand that we actually were losing, and the right wing was growing and growing and growing, and we were losing ground. And by 1980, which is only 12 years after '68, Ronald Reagan was elected president. And it's been, I think, a disaster for America ever since then. He's the one who said, government is the problem. And people believe this. And so we have a government now that doesn't do anything. And is so cruel to the, and so indifferent to the needs of people that we're falling apart as a country. And then you get this monster in office now, and I don't know what's going to happen, but it's been really bad.
But it is true that this is a slow movement, but it is a movement that includes backlash, right? So we are talking about white people. The demographics are very interesting for the Trump election because there are two things: whiteness and education, and an edge for men over women. But still, 53% of white women voted for Trump. It's a shocking number. But the education gap is decided. So people, white men without college education, 68% voted for Trump. And 63% of white women.
Without college.
Without college. That we've never seen that in an election before. Say someone like Romney, he got a lot of educated white people. Black people in general, of course, did not vote for Trump. Brown people, Asians, and people with college educations, you know, they were not his supporters.
But using the word the backlash is very important. Because only 8 years before, we elected Barack Obama president of the United States. Which I have to say, for me, was maybe my happiest moment as an American citizen. I thought, finally, we've done something good. Something, right? But but what that did was unleash a violent antipathy toward him. I would say among about 30% of the country. We're all these white people that Siri's talking about, the idea of a black man in the White House, even the colors there, that it's a black man in the White House was revolting to them. And they couldn't stomach the idea that he was president. And they banded together, immediately formed the Tea Party, which was devoted to destroying everything he was trying to do. And he was blocked and blocked and insulted and demeaned and treated with less dignity than any president in the history of the country that I know of. And so the great thing that we did by electing him turned out to be, in the end, what created this reaction that it's turned into a nightmare for us. Yeah.
Yeah, but we can't blame Obama, right?
No,
These
I'm not blaming
forces are, you know,
Obama.
people say, oh, well, it didn't work, but I think, I mean, look at this presidency. We don't know how long it will go on, but I can't imagine that all of these forces and a changing demographics in America, that is what these white people are upset about, is that diversity, right? So it's white male privilege that has been undermined. That you know, there's a book by Michael Kimmel, a sociologist. He was doing a television show with angry white men, and he had written a book called Angry White Men, and then he said, one of the men was saying, but you know, I was up for a job. I was competing for a job, and a black woman got it. And then he said, she took my job. And Michael Kimmel said, what makes you think it was your job?
Yeah. I hope at least you get to keep your jobs, because we're
unemployed.
Yeah, you're unemployed. That's very good. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.